Those were wives.
You
They
ain't
weren't
never been in.
slaves.
You ain't never been in Africa, so stop talking
Hey,
about Africa.
there's
I'm
history.
African. I'm African. Shut the fuck up.
There's whole books.
Hey, you.
In fact, there's
Well,
a
you know what? First of
hold on,
all,
hold on a second,
brother, brother, brother,
Hey,
brother.
in
you
fact,
shouldn't tell nobody to shut the fuck up. That's not cool. Don't do that. We can get our point across without that.
in fact, there's an article talking about how Nigerians
See, brother, you don't have to go on no
can I
more.
finish my statement?
Yeah, but you don't let nobody finish. Go
Go
ahead.
ahead and get
All right,
malaria.
go ahead.
Go ahead and get that Ebola
Gab.
fucking
Gab.
virus. Go ahead and get that AIDS virus, bitch. You fuck monkeys. Is that what you're trying to tell us?
Really? Okay.
Wow, sis.
GG, you're triggered still. Hey,
Let me-
Wow.
Yeah, but see, wait. He proved my point. Hey, Gab.
Did you let me finish my point first?
No, hold on. No. We're gonna wait.
Gab, can I finish my point?
Yes, sir. You can.
Thank you.
Maya,
No.
Relax,
Wait.
Maya, and GG.
Wait.
Don't do that again. You have to.
Wait.
You can't. No,
Excuse
Maya.
me, Gab. Excuse me, Gab. I don't like when people talk about my country, my
Listen,
family, my
we all got
ancestors.
countries. I get you. We all got countries. Don't disrespect my guests like that again, and I won't, and they won't disrespect you either. Okay. All right. Thank you.
In fact, the way I learned it is there's a couple of books written, and this has been a long history because they've said this back since the 1950s. But I read a book called Daughters of the Trade, so I actually started reading this stuff, started researching it. And ever since then, there has been articles and stuff coming out. In fact, so much to the point that a lot of West African countries saying that they need to pay or need to do something for reparations for descendants of African slaves that actually sold here and brought here to the diaspora because they were traded, they were sold. There was marriages and there's contracts and because everything the white men did coming down to West Africa, they had those are signed contracts. They had to report on that. There's logs and articles talking about how the white traders had to come in and marry into African families to actually do slave trading. This is fact. This is documented. There was just an article. In fact, I'm actually going to do that article tonight and put it up tonight because I just saw it 2 days ago. I was going to actually hold off the next week where Nigerian and something in Ghana is actually talking about giving descendants of slaves reparations for actually facilitating their trading into the Americas because even they said during that article there's no way that white men who were on the coast could go into the interior and start pulling slaves out. It was impossible. And even she said in her book, slaves had to be bought and sold 4 times before they actually made it to the coast. Okay, this is fact. It hurt me when I saw it because now I have to, as a Pan-African, I have to admit that shit went on.
My book is about. The marriage institution came to be known as casare in Danish, which was from the Portuguese casar to set up house or to get married. And the practice was an interracial or intercultural institution that Portuguese traders had used to marry into African families. Intercultural trading is really difficult. Intercultural slave trading is incredibly difficult. So slave trading is a very, very difficult business, as you may imagine, right? Because people will resist becoming slaves, of course. And so there is an incredible amount of both violence and an organization that needs to go into being a slave trader. So it is an even more difficult kind of trade than fur trading, for instance, in North America, where lots of marriages also took place. And actually, you can see that in the early modern world, all over, everywhere I look now, there are interracial marriages between European traders and people who they're trading with in the Americas, so in North America, South America, everywhere. Anyway, in the slave trade, it was crucially important to have and sustain diplomatic and trading relations that you could count on. Because the slave trade often involves many different sales, slaves often came from very far inland in West Africa, on the Gold Coast, but also in the other cases. I don't have this. The slave trading routes are actually on this map. So most people who were shipped out from the Gold Coast slave trading forts came from very far inland, and they would have been sold 4-5 times before they make it to the coast and get sold to the European ships. This means that when Europeans arrive on the coast, they have to count on people to travel inland to the next market, Kumasi, for instance, in this case, and bring goods in. So they would bring in iron rods typically, or some kind of material that you could exchange for people who you could then bring back to the coast. So Europeans counted on Africans for participating in the slave trade. And to do that, they needed trading partners that they could trust. And one of the ways to become a successful trader on the Gold Coast, and I believe the most important way to become a successful trader, is to marry into a West African family and getting the networks that comes with that, right? So not just your wife, but your in-laws and the whole kinship network that trade ran along the lines of in West Africa. And so in the beginning, when the Danes arrive on the coast, they adopt this practice of caçara from the Portuguese, and it becomes a crucial institution in the trade throughout the slave trade of the 18th century. They then continue until these interracial marriages continue in the 19th century after the official slave trade has ended in 1803. There are almost 2 generations more before the fort is sold to the British in 1850 and becomes part of the Gold Coast colony.
All right. This is the second half of my documentation, and this is from the Wall Street Journal. And the date that I have on it is September 23rd, 2019. Title Essay, When the Slave Traders Were African. Those whose ancestors sold slaves to Europeans now struggle to come to terms with a painful legacy. August marked the 400 years since the first documented enslaved Africans arrived in the U.S. in 1619. A ship reached the Jamestown settlement in the colony of Virginia, carrying some 20 and odd Negroes who were kidnapped from their villages in present-day Angola. The anniversary coincides with a controversial debate in the U.S. about whether the country owes reparations to the descendants of slaves as compensation for centuries of injustice and inequality. It is a moment for posing questions of historic guilt and responsibility. But the American side of the story is not the only one. Africans are now also reckoning with their own complicated legacy in the slave trade, and the infamous Middle Passage often looks different from across the Atlantic. Records from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, directed by historian David Eltis at Emory University, show the majority of captives brought to the United States came from Senegal, Gambia, Congo, and eastern Nigeria. Europeans oversaw this brutal traffic in human cargo, but they had many local collaborators. White people don't survive very well in tropical weather like that, subtropical weather like that. They die very easily. The organization of the slave trade was structured to have Europeans stay along the coastlines. Exactly what the lady was said in Daughters of the Trade, relying on African middlemen and merchants to bring slaves to them, said Toyin Fayola, a Nigerian professor of African Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Europeans couldn't have gone into the interior to get slaves themselves, exactly what the lady was saying. The anguished debate over slavery in the U.S. is often silent on the role that Africans played. That silence is echoed in many African countries, where there is hardly any national discussion or acknowledgement of the issue. From nursery school through university in Nigeria, I was taught about great African cultures and conquerors of times past, but not about African involvement in the slave trade. In an attempt to reclaim some of the dignity that we lost during colonialism, check this out. This is key. In an attempt to reclaim some of the dignity that we lost during colonialism, Africans tended to magnify stories of glorious past, rich traditions, and brave achievements. But there are other less discussed chapters of our history. When I was growing up, my father, Chukwuma Mbuani, spoke glowingly of my great-grandfather, Mbuani Ogo Oreku, best I can do, a chief among our Igbo ethnic group who sold slaves during the 19th century. It wasn't only white people who got rich. He was respected by everyone around. Even the white people respected him. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, an estimated 1.4 million Igbo people were transported from across the Atlantic as slaves. Some families have chosen to hide similar histories. We speak of it in whispers, said Yunus Muhammad Rafiq, a 44-year-old professor of anthropology from Tanzania who now teaches at New York University's Center in Shanghai. In the 19th century, Mr. Rafiq's great-great-great-grandfather, Mwakeri, from the Sengeyu ethnic group, raided villages in Tanzania's hinterland, sold the majority of his captives to Arab merchants who supplied Europeans and kept the rest as laborers on his own coconut plantations. Arabs didn't capture it. They sold and they transported, but they didn't capture. Same thing with the Europeans. What you start finding out when you actually start digging into the history. Also, Mr. Rafiq's relatives speak of Mumkari with pride. They expunged his name from family documents sometime in the 1960s, shortly after Tanzania gained independence from the British colonial rule, when it was especially sensitive to remind Africans of their role in enslaving one another. The need to keep his family's history secret intensified after Mr. Rafiq left home in his 20s to study at Indiana University and then at Yale and Brown for graduate work. Now, he had the money to actually do that. So, like I said, it wasn't the only wealth that was gained from the African slave trade. It wasn't always white. Truthfully, my African-American colleagues, I never realized this aspect because of the crimes, the pain, the humiliation that I saw them suffer in the United States. I thought talking about this legacy of Africans selling themselves is just piling another wound in a body that is already very shot through, fractured and broken down by other things. It's like them telling us that our mama's a whore. That if we thought they were good, honest, decent, God-fearing people, found out your mama's a hoe. And she had you by a trick. That's what it feels like. He decided instead to highlight the beauty of Tanzanian music, architecture, and poetry at Indiana, work with Black Student Union to organize events that would build bonds to Africa. Knowing this legacy and what we have done, it put so much pressure on me. In other words, you're living with a lie. Like Mr. Rafiq, I also felt apprehensive before deciding to write about my own family's history. I live in Nigeria, but have extended family all over the U.S. How would Black Americans respond to the descendants of a man who sold some of their ancestors into slavery? And if my own background was tainted with inhumanity, what authority would I have to lend my voice to the human rights issues in Nigeria and around Africa that caused me such grave concern? Interesting. Some families feel no qualms about publicizing their own history. I am not ashamed of it because I personally wasn't directly involved. Who does that sound like? And they said 58-year-old Donald Duke, a lawyer who ran for president in Nigeria's 2019 election. How does a Nigerian get the name Duke? He is from the port town of Calabar, home to the Ife ethnic group of Nigeria's Cross River State. In the 18th century, some
1.2 million slaves were sold through Calabar, according to the Tulane University historian Randy J. Sparks. The Fique were mostly stevedores and middlemen. They negotiated prices between the white traders and African partners from the hinterlands, and then collected royalties. Families like mine benefited from the process, Mr. Duke told me. Lucy, you got some splaining to do. Mr. Duke was an elected governor of Cross River State in 1999. His administration built the Slave History Museum near the point on the coast from which slaves were shipped. One of its exhibitions depicts various currencies of the slave trade, such as flutes, Dane guns. Check that out, Dane guns. The lady that was Danish, that actually wrote the book, and brass bells. It is not a glorious past, but it is the truth. That is why I went out to actually document it. The Zambian pastor, Sadi Francis Chishimba, also feels the need to go public with his family's history. In Zambia, in a sense, it is a forgotten history, said the 45-year-old. But it is a reality to which history still holds us accountable. Mr. Chishimba's grandfather was from a tribe of slave traders of the Bemba Kingdom, who moved from Zanzibar to establish slave markets in Zambia. He grew up hearing about the history narrated with great pride by his relatives. In 2011, he decided to see the place of his ancestors' origin and traveled with his wife to Zanzibar, an island off the coast of Tanzania. As they toured a memorial in what used to be one of the world's largest slave markets, the photos of limbs amputated from runaway slaves and the airless chambers that once held dozens of slaves at a time shocked him into silence. It brought a saddening in my heart that my own family lines were involved in this treatment. It was so painful to think about. Mr. Chishimba decided that this gruesome history should be openly acknowledged and has since become popular in Zambia for his sermons, radio talks, and articles on the impact of the slave trade. He uses them as an opportunity to demonstrate the grace of God, even in so wicked a practice. He believes, for example, that mixing the races was always God's plan, and the slave trade was an effective device for dispersing black people from Africa to other parts of the world. What the devil meant for evil, God used it for good. I've heard many of black people say that. I'm so glad that the slave traders came and took us out of Africa. Some families feel cursed or burdened by their history and wish they could be rid of it. What our ancestors did wasn't right, said 48-year-old Teddy, a journalist from southeastern Nigeria. If they had thought about the consequences, they wouldn't have done those things. I think that's crap. His great-grandfather was also an Igbo slave trader, and Mr. Mbuwani and his male relatives think that their own failure to produce children in a patrilineal society is a result of their family's role in bringing other people's lineages to an end. I didn't think twice about believing it, Mr. Nwamboki told me. He quoted a portion from the book of Exodus, which refers to God visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Similar Bible passages have become popular in certain religious circles in Nigeria. The pastors encourage their congregations to identify patterns in their afflictions and investigate their history for root causes, then ask God for forgiveness, usually after a period of fasting. In collaboration with his younger brother in England, Mr. Nwamboki is now making arrangements for priests to visit the family and advise on what steps to take to free them from their past. If not, the family will continue to go down, he said. My own family held a similar intervention in 2018, organized by my father, who at 79 is the oldest male and the head of the extended family. Members of the Mbuwani family in Nigeria and around the world participated in 3 days of prayer and fasting. So we're not the only religious people that are black in the world. On the final day, a few dozen who lived nearby gathered at my father's home, then accompanied him to the local Anglican church where a priest invoked God's mercies on us. In December, my father organized another ceremony. Hundreds of family members who were home for the Christmas holidays joined in the Thanksgiving service. This time we dressed in our Sunday best and danced merrily to the altar to present a special money offering as a token of gratitude to God for granting us a new beginning. Still, my father does not believe that the descendants of those who took part in the slave trade should now pay for those wrongs. As he points out, buying and selling human beings had been part of many African cultures as a form of serfdom before white people landed on our shores. And though many families can still retain the respect and influence accrued by their slave trading ancestors, the direct material gains have petered out over time. If anyone asks me for reparations, he sarcastically said, I will tell them to follow me to my backyards so I can pluck some money from the tree there and give it to them. Mr. Chinchimba takes a similar view. Slavery was wrong, but I do carry upon my shoulders the sins of my forefathers so that I should go around saying sorry. I don't think so. He said, Mr. Duke doesn't believe that Africans should play much of a part in the American reparations conversation because the injustices the descendants of slaves suffered stem primarily from their maltreatment and deprivation in the U.S. Africans didn't see anything wrong with slavery. Even if the white man wasn't there, they would still use these people as their domestics. However, because the white man is now involved and fortunes are being made, that was when criminality came in. Mr. Mbuwani wishes the matter were straightforward as paying reparations in cash. He says that he will be willing to hand over all his family's land and houses to anyone that suffered from his grandfather's slave trading, whether in Nigeria or the U.S. I am happy to give anything as long as it would bring an end to the suffering. He said, I will do whatever it will take to appease anybody, if only I can identify the particular people we offended. As for Mr. Rafik, he agrees that Africans owe something to the descendants of slaves in America, a forthright acknowledgement of their own complicity in the transatlantic trade. Educated Africans need to rewrite their history, especially post-colonial history, which was a kind of restorative history that tended to marginalize issues like slavery. He said, part of the compensation is telling the truth of our part in what is happening to African Americans today. Mr. Mbuwani, a Nigerian writer and journalist, her debut novel, I Do Not Come to You by Chance, won the 2010 Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best Fiction Book. All right. Very long article. And this is what I want to say. The African slave trade was just that, a trade. And as one person said in this article, slavery or serfdom existed well before the white people ever even touched the shores of on the continent. Well before. So the great evil that we call slavery is actually done by everybody. In all parts of the world, traded in human flesh for labor. Did the Europeans carry it to an extreme? Yes, but that doesn't remove the complicity of what the Africans that's still on the continent actually did. And there's a lot of different examples of how proxies for the white men, because they had access to weapons, actually visited themselves on other African people that were not so fortunate. So the original sin of slavery does not just exist in white man's hands. And yes, what black women did marry into the slave trade, did marry white men, did marry Arab men, and participated joyfully in this particular selling of flesh because it was normal. It is what it is. But with that, I'm going to jump off here. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.